Hi, good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis of Israel's war against Hamas, in the Gaza Strip. I'm Yaakov Katz, a senior fellow at JPPI, and I'm joined this evening by my colleague and another senior fellow at JPPI, Shmuel Rosner, as well as former member of Knesset and a former fellow at JPPI, Einat Wilf. There's a lot to talk about since we last convened here on Thursday, and this evening I do want to talk to Shmuel and Einat on what I think is probably the two more pressing issues that are on Israel's agenda right now. And as we're talking this evening, there is Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin is here visiting in Israel together with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And we had Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who was here over the weekend. There's a lot going on about this timeline and about this conversation of Israel moving from what people are calling the high intensity stage of the conflict to the lower intensity stage of the conflict. So that's something that we're definitely going to dive into. There's also the issue of the hostages, which continues to be something that is of extreme concern. We saw the tragedy of what happened on Friday morning. The news came out on Friday evening of 3 hostages who were shot and killed by Israeli soldiers in Sajaiya in the Gaza Strip on Friday, misidentified. Whatever happened there really brought again to the forefront this issue of the operation and the efforts to retrieve and secure the hostages. So there's a lot to talk about there. But before we dive into all of that, I did an interview just the other day with Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the executive director of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, talking about the rise and explosion of anti-Semitism across the United States, as well as, of course, what happened at Congress with the presidents of Penn, Harvard, and MIT, an issue we've gone back to a few times, and him and his organization's interesting relationship with Elon Musk. So here is the interview with Jonathan Greenblatt, and then we will get back to those issues I just outlined with Einat and Shmuel. Jonathan, it's great to have you with us at JPPI. Thank you so much.
It's always good to see you, Yaakov, and also to be doing work with JPPI, which is such an important organization, particularly in moments like this.
So we're talking while you're in Israel. I was looking through some of your recent tweets, spending time with hostages, just traveling across the country. And I'm curious, as someone who's probably visited here countless times, but to come at a moment of war, which is a very different experience for people, I'm guessing. What's it been like overall?
Well, I arrived yesterday, so I'm still sort of taking it in. But as soon as I arrived, the first thing I did was visit Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. And it's just an overwhelming feeling. I mean, I think on the one hand, there is a kind of somberness that I haven't seen before. And yet there's also a kind of, what would I call it? Like morale seems very high to me. There is a resolve, I guess would be the word, a kind of resolve that is real and palpable. The sense that Israelis are going to win this war, the sense that Israelis are going to get the hostages back, the sense that Israelis are not going to budge. And that, I was here many times, Yaakov, over the last year during if we could call it the political crisis.
Right.
And that all seems, at least if not gone, it seems like it's on hold right now. That's my sense, that people are united in realizing they need to address the issue in Gaza, get the hostages back, and try to end this threat that Hamas has always posed, but that was laid so bare on October the 7th.
So you've been doing a lot of studies at the ADL, tracking obviously anti-Semitism. We're speaking just after the holiday of Hanukkah, where we saw a number of incidents of menorahs across the United States, defamed, defaced. There was one at Harvard Yard. I saw you write about, but there was across just all over California, places that were burned, menorahs that were burned down, not just on college campuses. I'm curious, New Haven, I think, or somewhere in Connecticut, maybe. But this comes in at a rise, just general, extreme rise of anti-Semitism, explosion ever since October 7th. What can you tell us about how bad the situation is, how concerned you are?
Well, ADL, we're a very data-driven organization, very focused and sort of in an evidence-based way on understanding the parameters of the problem so that we can address it. And we've been measuring anti-Semitic attitudes and tracking incidents for about 45 years. And we've never seen data like this, Yaakov. And I will say, backing up, the numbers had accelerated before October the 7th. Before October the 7th, we'd seen an over 500% increase in anti-Semitic acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence over the last decade. I mean, the highest number we ever tracked was 2019, and then 2021, and then 2022. So I want to just contextualize what I'm about to share by reminding our listeners that we previously had seen these numbers increase in ways that were incredibly alarming. And then after October 7th, we've seen a tsunami of anti-Semitism. So literally over a 60-day period, a 337% increase over last year's record number. So we're talking about well over 2,000 incidents, including scores of physical assaults, hundreds of acts of vandalism, almost 750 cases of clear, indisputable harassment, and over 900 rallies, what do we, to call it a rally sort of understates it, Yaakov. These are like mobilizations with clear and undeniable anti-Semitism, calls for terror against Israel or Jews. So whereas I think for a long time, it felt to us at ADL like the metaphor of frogs in the boiling water, suddenly the temperature went way, way, way up. And on the point you were just making about the menorahs, I mean, not that your listeners need to hear this, but the menorah is just a religious symbol. Hanukkah is a faith observance. It is not some political statement. And yet I think the story that's most telling, and you alluded to it, is at the Harvard Yard, Harvard University, their campus. The administration did not allow the Hillel to keep the menorah out every night for fear that it would be vandalized and that Harvard would be held responsible. So it's a good example because at Harvard University, arguably the most prestigious university in America, maybe the world, Jews can't simply observe their faith in public like members of other communities. That is a very, very, very sad sign. And I don't really care if you like or don't like Bibi Netanyahu. I don't really care if you define yourself as a Zionist or something other than that. I don't really care how you see the world. An America in which Jews simply can't observe their traditions openly like all other faiths, that's not the place that I grew up.
So where does this go? Because I mean, I could potentially voice concern. I don't know that if I'm a Jew, obviously take Harvard as an example or anywhere of these other places, I'll hide my Judaism. I don't want to be known as a Jew because I don't want to come under attack. So does it lead to this hiding of Jewish identity or this decline in Jewish identity? I mean, like if we think of the long-term consequence, or is America no longer safe for Jews? I don't think you'll say that, but what's next? Where does this lead to?
Well, there are different ways to look at that. So in terms of where it leads to, I am definitely seeing a surge of Jewish pride and Jewish unity, again, the likes of which I don't think this country has seen since probably the days of the fight to free the Soviet Jews. So this is best exemplified by what happened on the Washington Mall last month, where more than 300,000 people came together to celebrate, but to call for the release of the hostages, to show support for Israel. And there, Yaakov, you had an amazing, amazing spectacle. You had Jewish people wearing MAGA hats, standing next to Jewish people wearing Pride t-shirts. You don't see that too often. I'm hard-pressed to think of another political kind of gathering in America where you would ever see that. It was multi-denominational, it was multiracial. You had Jews from different ethnicities. By the way, there were a lot of non-Jews there too. It was extraordinary. And so I've seen examples like this of Jewish pride. I've heard the stories, even in my own family, of kids putting on their kippot of people showing up and, with strength. And that's a very Jewish response. On the other hand, I think it's also fair to say that there's this phenomenon I talk about. We have abrasive anti-Semitism, which is, Yaakov, the tear down the menorah, assault a Jewish person. But then I also frame this phenomenon I describe as erasive anti-Semitism, just not inviting the Jewish group to the round table where other NGOs are coming together to talk about some social issue. Or the communities said, you know what, we're not going to do a public menorah lighting this year. Erasive anti-Semitism is sort of a sin of omission, and it's harder to measure. So on the one hand, I'm seeing an explosion of Jewish pride. On the other hand, I am seeing what I believe is efforts to erase Jewish presence from places. Now, I think that the real trick in terms of where does this goes, we have seen universities really emerge, Yaakov, as what would you call it? Like the center of the storm. If this is a hurricane, they're the eye of the hurricane.
Right.
And one of the issues I'm hoping we're going to see more of is the issue of deterrence in those places. So suspending the activists who target and harass their Jewish classmates, expelling the organizations or dechartering the groups who vandalize the Hillel or threaten the rights, again, of other Jewish people on campus. And we saw this take measures when they violate the law, as happened at Brown University just last week. So I think when we say, where does this go? If law enforcement, if people in positions of authority start demonstrating deterrence, I think that could stop this. The challenge is when they don't demonstrate deterrence, extremists feel emboldened and they operate with impunity.
Do you think that the hearing at Congress with the three university presidents, Penn, Harvard, MIT, and the eventual resignation or dismissal, whatever it was, of the Penn University president, will that help create deterrence to some extent? Do you think that will lead to more of a crackdown? They'll start to take this a little more seriously?
There's no question that the sight of three university presidents being compelled to testify and then being grilled, I think, demonstrated to academia that they are not in some ivory tower and unreachable by the laws of man. Suddenly they had to contend with a kind of accountability that simply rarely happens. And then, of course, as you said, University of Pennsylvania President Liz McGill resigned, and Harvard President Claudine Gay has come under tremendous stress. I think she'll bear this out. I think she will not resign or be terminated. But I will tell you, this week, the House of Representatives passed a resolution calling for President Gay and President Kornbluth at MIT to be terminated because they have been so lackadaisical on this. And there was another thing that happened that you may or may not have caught. This week, the Pennsylvania legislature pulled back on, and I guess you could say rescinded, a $33 million grant to the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. So this goes from being politicized, if you will, to now becoming policy. So when legislature starts saying, we're going to pull back funds from public institutions, the federal government has this power as well. The federal government, through something called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, can also launch investigations and either terminate existing grants or withhold future funding. This could have major consequences. So I am optimistic that, again, a kind of deterrence being generated by elected officials will finally remind these university presidents that they have a responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility, let alone a moral responsibility to do the right thing.
So, Jonathan, I before I let you go, I got to ask you one last question. Elon Musk, you guys have been sparring a bit over the last few months. It's been very interesting to watch.
I bet.
From him attacking you in ADL to some sort of reconciliation over time, his visit to Israel, him going back to the U.S. at that New York Times conference summit wearing the dog tags of the hostages and talking about that in front of his literally over 100 and something million followers on X, what is known as Twitter. a very interesting character, obviously, Elon Musk. But even his visit here was really seen through two different lenses, right? There were those who I think got caught on what you had with him, which is this endorsement of great replacement theory that it seemed like, and other insinuations of anti-Semitism and how the platform is just used by anti-Semites, but also people who looked at him and said, "Let me listen, he comes here, he wears these dog tags, he does what he does." Like, how are we as Jews supposed to look at this character and his platform?
Well, I think it's safe to say Elon Musk is a character.
Yeah.
He is an incredibly unique individual. It is not an understatement to describe him as a genius. I mean, what he's done in the business world literally has no precedent, right? From SpaceX to Tesla to Starlink. I mean, this is the guy, I don't know if you know this, Yaakov, he started OpenAI
Yeah.
10 years ago. 10 years ago, he started working on this issue of generative artificial intelligence way before it was kind of a household word. So he is really a remarkable individual. He's a complicated individual with a long history that, Walter Isaacson detailed in his compendium, in his sort of this magnum opus that he was published this summer. So that is to say that, like a lot of geniuses and complicated people, there are multiple dimensions of Elon. And so it is true that X, which, by the way, well, let's just call it Twitter for the purposes of this conversation. Twitter had profound problems with anti-Semitism before Elon
100%.
purchased the company. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was detailed by us at ADL, by many others. Our Center for Technology and Society was tracking this. Huge problems. Elon purchases the platform and makes some changes. And one of his deeply held beliefs is that it needs to be a platform for free speech. Now, in my mind, freedom of speech doesn't include the freedom to slander people. And freedom of expression shouldn't include the freedom to incite violence against individuals based on their identity. That is not protected speech according to the U.S. Constitution, according to legal precedent in America. That being said, that type of speech, those types of tweets or posts have flourished on the platform previously, and since Elon took it over, he has permitted many folks who were previously banned to get back on. So to the first question you're asking, or to break down your question, Twitter had and has an anti-Semitism problem. That is not unique. A lot of the social media platforms like TikTok and the others have it too. And yet I have called it out when he has replatformed people like Alex Jones, who is really beyond repair, in my opinion. And when he has also allowed people to spread toxic anti-Semitic memes and conspiracy theories, and he's retweeted some of them, and I've called that out. And at the same time, what we saw prior to his trip to Israel, where he talked about the need to start banning those who push out the hashtags like River to the Sea or decolonization, that's actually a good thing. Right. Because we know those are being used as a pretext to spread toxic anti-Semitism. So I think at ADL, our job is not to play for the red team or the blue team. At ADL, our job is not to play for the Democrats or the Republicans. At ADL, our job is to call balls and strikes. And the way that I see it, I believe not in cancel culture. I believe in counsel culture. When someone gets it wrong, I think it's our obligation as Jews, let alone as ADL, Yaakov, not to push them away, but to pull them in. If you get it wrong, I want to try to help you get it right. And in that vein, we criticize Elon when he gets it wrong, and we'll credit him when he gets it right. Now, that doesn't, preclude us. If we've criticized him over here, we could still give him credit. And if we credit him over here, it doesn't somehow exonerate the previous things he's done. The guy is on a journey. I don't agree with everything that he does, but I will say, if we can make X a safer place for its Jewish users and for all its users, by the way, that's a good outcome for all of us. And that's the only thing I'm interested in here. Not going after him for his personality, not attacking him at some ad hominem. I don't want to do that. What I want to do is make X safer for everyone. And in that spirit is how I've approached this. And where we are with him and with the company, only time will tell, but we'll take it one day at a time.
Very interesting. Jonathan Greenblatt, thank you so much for joining us here at JPPI.
It's always good to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
That was Jonathan Greenblatt. Always interesting to one of the most important topics, obviously, of the world right now is what's happening with anti-Semitism. But I want to jump back, and if you do, Einat, Shmuel, if you have comments that you want to say in response to the interview, feel free. But I do want to talk a moment about the what's happening on the ground and focus for a few minutes about the Israel-U.S. relationship and what we're seeing here with this parade of top officials who have been coming to Israel, meeting with the war cabinet, discussing with us about this transfer or transition from high intensity to low intensity. Einat, are you identifying, like I am to an extent, of a tension that's there between Israel and America, A, in the timeline, but B, also in what we're all very familiar with the day after. They want the Palestinian Authority. Bibi is saying no Fatahstan, like no Hamastan, playing a bit of politics. But there does seem to be a genuine disagreement of what the transition will look like, and of course what the day after will look like.
U.S. and American interests, by definition, always converge. Always diverge. We're lucky when they converge, but by definition of our geographies, they're never going to be the same. Israel is literally in the midst of the danger. Israel has to defend itself, being surrounded by the attacks. The United States is a massive ocean away. It has commercial interests in the Red Sea. Therefore, it has an interest in maintaining this war from getting out of hand, for limiting Israel's ability to wage this war in a way that at least increases the chances that, from the American perspective, it gets out of hand. This is not about people. This is not about governments. This is not about individual sentiments. This is just the old style geopolitical interest, literally in the sense of geography. The geography of the United States and the geography of Israel are very different. And as a result, they have divergent interests. And the role of any Israeli government is to try to operate as much as possible within those divergent interests.
Shmuel, this tension, though, does have political ramifications, right? And I've been of the opinion that Netanyahu wants to. It doesn't hurt him necessarily to even have a bit of tension with the Americans, because he can use this to shore up support among his right-wing base and say, look at me, the tough guy. I can stand up to even the best of U.S. presidents, the closest of friends to Israel. What do you think?
Well, it doesn't hurt him, and it doesn't hurt President Biden either. In fact, I cynically speaking, I would assume that they both collaborate to have this public tension, because it helps both of them, Netanyahu domestically here in Israel, and President Biden in the United States. So maybe this is all a type of theater that they play for us. I tend to believe that the tension between the U.S. and Israel is somewhat overhyped in recent days and weeks. Of course, there are differences and there are negotiations, and there is some kind of back and forth between the two governments. But by and large, I don't hear from the Americans anything that is troubling, in the sense that they abandon the initial proposition that the end goal of this war ought to be Gaza, not under the rule of Hamas. And as long as the two countries agree that Hamas cannot play a role in governing Gaza, then the question of the day after becomes a question of nuance than one in which, it is easy for Netanyahu to say this will not be Hamastan. Well, of course not. There's no one who believes it should be a Hamastan except for Hamas, Iran, and the Houthis in Yemen. All others already agreed that it cannot be Hamastan. When Netanyahu says it cannot be Fatahstan, I see it as a sign that he doesn't want to specifically preclude the possibility of the Palestinian Authority. Rather than saying it cannot be the Palestinian Authority, he says no to Fatah. Okay, so we have some room for maneuver here. President Biden said, I want a revitalized Palestinian Authority. Netanyahu says it cannot be the Palestinian Authority if the Palestinian Authority supports terrorism or finances terrorism. What does it mean to be a revitalized Palestinian Authority? A PA that doesn't support terrorism. If we reach such situation, then there's no debate. We can put the PA in charge. By and large, I think that the prospect of seeing the Palestinian Authority ruling Gaza is not something that can happen in the short term. This is not something for the coming weeks or few months. So we are having this discussion about what's going to happen in 5 months, half a year, 8 months. Who knows if Netanyahu is going to be there as prime minister? Who knows what's going to happen in the war, if Israel is victorious, if Hamas is still there, if the leaders of Hamas are still there. There's so much that's going on that putting too much emphasis on these nuanced differences between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden, again, I think it's overstating the level of the debate. I don't think there is a huge debate.
Well, first of all, I mean, I just have to push back on the heresy that you just said of Netanyahu not being here. I mean, I can't imagine such a scenario. But the PA and again, I've been playing those word games too. He says Fatah, he doesn't say PA. What exactly that looks like? But Einat, today, Yoav Gallant, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, is here in Israel. They had a press conference. By the way, as we're speaking, tragically, unfortunately, announcement of 2 additional IDF soldiers who the IDF just released were killed. Captain Yarin Gahali and Captain Netanel Silberg, unfortunately killed in the battles in Gaza. But Gallant at the press conference with Austin spoke about we're not going to occupy Gaza, right? That's been an American red line. And also in Israel, no one really has the appetite for it, unless you're some fringe messianic, element on the right. But we're paving the way for non-hostile entities was the term in Hebrew, to take over. Okay, last I checked, I don't see anyone out there lining up to come into Gaza. So who are we fooling, or who are we talking about?
So perhaps we're fooling ourselves. As I'm sure you know, there are a lot of ideas there to have the Saudis, to have the Emiratis, ideally do for Gaza what they did for the Gulf. I mean, I think we can all agree that in a perfect world, if we can get the UAE to do for Gaza what it did for the UAE, then we will all be in a very different place. Maybe there's a desire to have Egypt take some of the role that it had in Gaza in the past. So I know that this is the Israeli desire. There's no question about that. And in that sense, Gallant was reflecting a deep Israeli desire that there will be a proper non-hostile governance in Gaza that will take the people of Gaza to an age of prosperity and peace. There don't seem to be any takers. Would that change? Would an Israeli victory, or would perhaps a deterioration of conditions lead Egypt? There's no question that there's literally pressure of Egypt and Israel as to who can push Gaza more into the arms of the other. So will Egypt be forced by Israel to take a greater role than the one that it wants? Will Jordan in the West Bank? Will the Gulf states? But again, I think that what Israel has failed to do still is to be very clear, not about who rules Gaza, but about what, and to just discuss the ideology, because if we don't address the ideology, if we continue to mouth platitudes that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians or Hamas doesn't represent the people of Gaza, when it should be said, Hamas enjoys greater popularity and legitimacy than any elected government in the West today. So they are one of the most popular movements, governments, call it what you will, among the Palestinians. They represent the Palestinian ideology of no Jewish state. So the question should not be who rules Gaza. The question is, what ideology will the people of Gaza and the Palestinian people continue to uphold? And as long as that's their ideology, all other questions, I think, remain secondary.
I want to move for a moment, Shmuel, to the hostages, because we saw obviously the tragedy of Friday and those 3 hostages who were killed. Whatever happened there, we still don't know. Mistaken identity, a soldier who one single soldier made a mistake, commanders made a mistake. That'll be looked into, and I'm sure the IDF is hopefully applying some of those lessons. What stayed with me throughout the entire Shabbat and the weekend was the what if. Now imagine had they rescued the hostages, it would have given such a boost to the Israeli people, to the military campaign. It would have showed not only Israelis that this is working, it would have showed the world, obviously we'll always have our detractors, but it would have showed the world why this operation is so imperative, because it's bringing back, it's not only degrading Hamas, it's freeing the hostages. And that it was so hard to not view it in that way, because it was such a shock. But what it also does, I think, is now, because of the tragic outcome, it is making us second guess the operation on the ground to an extent. And it's also putting greater pressure on the government to maybe, again, reach some sort of deal with Hamas. That would be a pause, some sort of ceasefire, some sort of stop, some sort of withdrawal, maybe. I don't know what it would look like. How do you see this playing out?
Look, in I think it was June of 1982, 4 Israeli phantoms mistakenly identified an Israeli convoy in Lebanon as enemy force and bombed our own soldiers and killed 25 Israeli soldiers. Israeli aircraft, the Air Force, killed 25 Israeli soldiers. War is always heartbreaking, and errors in war are even more heartbreaking than our people being killed by enemy fire. But we need to separate here the tragic event, and it was, in many ways, it was heartbreaking for all Israelis to realize that these 3 hostages were just meters away from being freed, and a mistaken decision, split-hair decision by a certain commander put an end to what could have been a miraculous moment. Then again, when I look at Israelis, their demand to release the hostages is clear, but their demand to defeat Hamas is no less clear. If you are hinting at the possibility that Israelis will now, because of this incident, give up on the objective of defeating Hamas in exchange for more emphasis on the release of hostages, I don't think this is happening. I think Israelis are still adamant in their demand to defeat Hamas. They do want the Israeli government and the IDF to do whatever is necessary to find the hostages, to release them, to put pressure on Hamas to release them, to use all diplomatic means to try and put pressure on Hamas to release them. but I don't see in the Israeli public any weakening of the resolve to end this war in a proper way as defined by Israel. That's why I'm also somewhat less concerned about the differences between Israel and the United States. I don't think there is much daylight between Israeli coalition and opposition, people within the government and out of the government, people who protest and people who do not protest. I think Israelis are still very much united in their demand for certain result for the war. And I don't think that the tragic incident on Friday
It's going to
changed their attitudes.
I will just say that a certain result, as you just described it, is a very elusive term. And anyhow, victory in this type of war is also very elusive, because the conquering of territory is not enough when you're fighting an enemy like Hamas. We've conquered Gaza. Okay, so what? We didn't get back the hostages. We didn't kill the leadership. It's still intact. They, as I saw on Friday, as we're getting ready for Shabbat, air sirens go off. They could still fire rockets at Jerusalem. One was intercepted not far from on top of my house. So
and that's why the war is still ongoing, because
100%. But
to Einat and to you and to me that we did not yet win the war.
100%. But my question, Einat, then is, can the government, or should the government, be just explaining to Israelis that victory, what victory is? Now, no one has said we're going to destroy Hamas, we're going to topple Hamas, we're going to kill. I mean, okay, fine. We all know that these are terms that don't really mean much. No one has really spoken about what victory looks like here.
Because then they're going to be measured by it. And it's the one thing that certainly no one wants to do in this situation. But in terms of what the people of Israel deserve rather than what they're actually getting, you're absolutely right. We have had no clarity from the political leadership as to what are the goals, what they seek to achieve. And it's also important because these are things that work together. Once you define the goals, they also become, by definition, the terms of surrender. Any definition of victory is also the definition of the other side's surrender and loss. So if Israel were to say, the war could end tomorrow when the following elements are achieved: the hostages are released, Hamas disarms, the tunnels are exposed, and the perpetrators and planners of the massacre are handed over to justice, and I add, and there is a public process and disavowal of from the river to the sea ideology, then by doing so, you're defining for your own people what are the goals of the war. You're defining it to the world, which is something that we've been lacking, to be able to tell the world, we actually don't want this war. We didn't start it. We're happy to end it tomorrow. Those are the four conditions. Anyone who wants to do it in our place is more than welcome to do so. And this is how you make it clear to the Israeli public what you want, you make it clear to the world, and you make it clear to your enemies what are the terms that will bring an end to the war. We have been lacking in this clarity from our leaders, and if there's anything I've been calling for from the first day, is that.
I couldn't agree more on that. Shmuel, we have 2 minutes left. I have a question from an anonymous attendee who's wondering how Americans who should be contacting their Congress representatives, what should they be telling them is the best way to support Israel? The one thing that comes to mind for me right now in these days is that I think in 5 days from now, Congress goes on recess till after the new year. The aid package to Israel and Ukraine, for that matter, is still stuck because of these arguments between Republicans and Democrats about border security. Push your congressmen to get through that aid for Israel. Is there something else, Shmuel?
Well, aid for Israel is important, but I think that public support and showing Americans, demonstrating to the administration that the American public and that the American Congress is supportive of Israel's objectives, and that it wants to see Israel going through this process and pursuing it to a successful end, I think that's no less important than the material assistance. Material assistance is, of course, important, but telling the Americans that for Israel to show the resolve and to do this for as long as it takes, that's of huge importance, because people are becoming impatient,
Right.
and impatience around the world is the enemy of Israel at this time.
Very interesting. I want to thank Shmuel, Einat, Jonathan Greenblatt from the ADL, and to all our viewers and listeners. We will be back on Thursday for another episode of JPPI's Inside Analysis of the War. Until then, have a good night, and thank you for being with us.